There was a time when the walls of Jerusalem were still standing, but inside, the hearts of the people were already in ruins. It was a period of instability, fear, and wrong decisions. It was in this setting that Baruch was born, the son of Neriah, belonging to a noble family of Judah. His lineage carried the blood of the elite, and his education was one of the best that could be had at that time. From a young age, he showed skill with letters, ink, and papyrus scrolls. He was diligent, disciplined, and attentive to detail, but behind the scrolls, the world around him was falling apart. The kings of Judah, weak in character, gave in to idolatry and ignored the cries of the prophets. Babylon was approaching like a growing shadow, and few understood the real danger. The priests were corrupt, the leaders blind, and the people hardened. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. Baruch, despite his privileged position, was not indifferent to the suffering around him. He walked the streets of Jerusalem, observing the abandoned poor, the forgotten orphans, the pagan cults that took over the altars. Something in his spirit burned, a longing for meaning, for truth, for a purpose greater than the comfortable life he could choose to follow. It was then that his path crossed that of a lonely man with tired eyes and a firm voice, Jeremiah, the prophet that no one wanted to hear, who had no followers or prestige, but who spoke with the authority of heaven. The meeting between the two was no coincidence. God was writing a secret story in which every detail mattered, even the hands that would hold the pen. In his time with Jeremiah, Baruch saw that true greatness was not found in positions or titles, but in being faithful to what God said, even if it cost him everything. And there, amid the spiritual collapse of the nation, Baruch began to discover that his mission was not just to copy words, it was to carry, with fear, the living message of the Most High. And as chaos grew in the streets and palaces, he took his first steps on a journey that would lead him to record, with ink and tears, the eternal designs of God. Before continuing, I want to invite you to comment on which city or country you are watching from. Let's see how far this message is reaching. Baruch did not know it, but what seemed like just a writing job would become a mission laden with spiritual weight. Jeremiah, already known as the weeping prophet, faced contempt, persecution, and isolation for denouncing the sins of Judah and announcing imminent destruction. His fiery speeches against idolatry and corruption did not please kings or priests. Still, he persisted, with tears in his eyes and fire in his heart. It was in this context that Jeremiah entrusted Baruch with a unique responsibility to record everything that the Lord revealed to him. Sitting in silence inside a simple dwelling, Jeremiah dictated words that burned like embers, and Baruch, with steady hands, drew them on the scroll. Line after line, he understood that he was not writing for men, but for eternity. Living with the prophet was not easy. Jeremiah lived under constant threat. At times he was beaten, imprisoned, humiliated, and yet he did not stop proclaiming. Baruch saw everything up close. He learned to deal with contempt, with accusing glances, and with the burden of carrying truths that no one wanted to hear. Once, Jeremiah was forbidden from entering the temple. Still, the message needed to be announced. Jeremiah entrusted Baruch with the public reading of the scroll before the people in the heart of God's house. It was more than an act of courage, it was an act of obedience. And Baruch obeyed. With a firm voice he read every word before everyone. The hope was that the people would repent, but their hearts were hardened. The news reached the palace, the leaders were disturbed, and King Jehoiakim, upon hearing the reading, tore the scroll with a knife and threw it into the fire. Word by word, he burned everything Baruch had written. It was an act of rebellion, a direct affront to the voice of God. For many, that could have been the end. But for Jeremiah and Baruch, it was only the beginning. God commanded them to write everything again, and even more. The scribe did not hesitate. He sat down, took a deep breath, and started over, because that calling was not based on success, but on faithfulness. And Baruch, now more than a scribe, was also a witness to the rejection and perseverance of a prophet. If this content is touching your heart, you can support this project by donating any amount by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. Your support helps me to continue telling these stories with dedication. The streets of Jerusalem became increasingly dangerous for those who dared to speak in the name of the Lord. False prophets multiplied, feeding illusory hopes. They said that everything would be fine, that the city would never fall, that Babylon would be defeated. But Jeremiah said the opposite, and whoever stood by him would suffer the consequences. Baruch knew this. He knew that carrying Jeremiah's scrolls was like carrying torches in the middle of a field of dry straw, but he did not back down. He wrote again, line by line, everything the king had burned. The new scroll, dictated in even greater detail by Jeremiah, carried the same grave tone of judgment, but it also revealed something else, the unshakable steadfastness of God's word, which could not be extinguished by the fire of men. With the new text ready, new threats arose. The officials, realizing that the word persisted, decided to arrest Jeremiah and Baruk, but the Lord hid them. They disappeared for a time, protected by God, while the city burned in confusion. During this period of concealment, Baruk experienced a silent conflict. He felt the weight of the mission. Writing was easy, but writing amid rejection, the risk of death and abandonment, was something else. He began to carry within him a bitter feeling, the desire to be recognized, to have some kind of reward for his dedication. It was not open vanity, but a restlessness of the soul. It was then that the word of the Lord came especially to him. God, knowing Baruch's heart, said, "Did you seek greatness for yourself? Do not seek it." It was a call to humility, to total surrender. There was no glory in this path, only silent service, obedient faith, and the comfort of knowing that God saw him even when no one else did. From that moment on, something changed in Baruch. He understood that his calling was not to shine, but to hold the torch alight while the world grew dark. And even as the city sank into idolatry and injustice, he continued to write. His steady hands continued to record each word as if it were his last. Because, in the end, it was not about being remembered by men, but about being faithful to the God who speaks, even in the midst of men's silence. Baruch's faithfulness was beginning to take a heavy toll. He was no longer just a scribe in the shadows. He was now recognized as an accomplice of the most rejected prophet of his time. Wherever he went, he was viewed with suspicion. People whispered when they saw him pass by. Some openly avoided him. Others accused him of being against his own nation. Those who had once respected him for his noble origins now treated him as a traitor. The doors that had once been opened to him because of his influential family were closing. His social life, his professional future, even his personal safety, everything seemed to be falling apart, little by little. But what hurt Baruch most was not what was happening outside. It was what was happening inside. Silently, he began to wonder if all that effort was worth it. After all, Jeremiah continued to be ignored. No king had repented. No priest had changed his stance. The people, instead of awakening, seemed to sink deeper and deeper. And he, Baruch, wrote, read, took risks, and nothing changed. There was a moment when anguish overcame him. He vented to Jeremiah himself, speaking of his weariness, his pain, his soul full of unrest. It was the muffled cry of a loyal but human servant. Someone who, even on the right path, felt the weight of continuing, and it was at that moment that God visited him again with direct and transformative words. The Lord did not rebuke him harshly, but firmly repositioned him. He made Baruch see that something greater was happening, that he was not forgotten, that God would take care of his life even in the midst of the destruction that would come upon the nation. The divine response did not bring immediate relief, but it brought clarity. Baruch understood that God's call did not promise comfort, but presence. It did not guarantee applause, but truth. And if the price of faithfulness was isolation, rejection, and pain, he would accept to pay it. From then on, there was no more lamentation. There was silence, yes, but also a firm conviction, and that conviction would be essential to face the even darker days that were to come, for the city was about to fall, and the faithful would be tested in the fire. The fall of Jerusalem did not happen suddenly, but when it came, it was devastating. The words that Jeremiah had announced for so long were fulfilled before everyone's eyes. The walls were torn down, the temple burned, the leaders executed or taken into captivity. The holy city was turned to ashes and tears. Baruch witnessed it all, not only with his eyes, but with a broken heart. He had written about that day, he had warned the people, he had read the messages with the hope of repentance. Now, in the face of destruction, he felt the pain of seeing a prophecy fulfilled without any real change. What he had recorded in ink was now becoming reality before his eyes, but the mission was not yet over. Jeremiah, spared by the Babylonians, remained in the land with a small group of poor and scattered Jews, and Baruk, faithful as ever, stood by his side. It was a time of mourning and confusion. Many were lost, without leadership, without direction. It seemed that finally the people would listen, but even then there was no obedience. Soon internal disputes arose. A rebellious leader killed Gedaliah, the governor appointed by the Babylonians. Chaos reigned once again. The people, fearing reprisals, decided to flee to Egypt. Jeremiah warned them that this was disobedience. God had told them to remain in the land. But they did not listen. They dragged the prophet with them, and they dragged Baruch too. It is not clear whether Baruch wanted to go, but we know that he did, perhaps out of conviction, perhaps out of love and loyalty to Jeremiah, perhaps because he understood that his mission was not to choose easier paths, but to remain with the word, wherever it might be. And at that time, the word was still with Jeremiah. In Egypt, the spiritual climate was even heavier. The people continued to worship idols, now with even more brazenness. It was as if nothing had been learned. For Baruk, this was more than devastating. It was like walking through a valley with no horizon. But he remained. He continued to write. He continued to be a witness to God's faithfulness amid the unfaithfulness of men. Exile for him was not only geographical, it was also spiritual. Living among a people who rejected God, even after judgment, required silent courage and unshakable faith. And even without knowing it, he was still writing history. Egypt was a foreign land, full of pagan gods and temples. For a faithful Jew, every corner represented a painful reminder of what had been lost. Baruch walked through this new setting with the weight of longing and the pain of collective failure. Jerusalem was far away, and more than distant in space. It seemed distant in time, like an old dream that had fallen apart. Even there, Jeremiah did not remain silent. God still spoke, still sent messages, still sought the hearts of a rebellious people. Baruch continued to record everything, now in a strange land, now without the slightest popular support. Each scroll he wrote was like a candle lit in the middle of a long night. Few saw it, almost no one cared, but he continued. Baruch did not write only judgments. He also had the privilege of recording words of hope. Amidst so much destruction, Jeremiah announced a new covenant, a future of restoration, a time when God would write his laws on the hearts of men. That nourished Baruch's soul. Even though his eyes would never see that time come, his hands were building the way for it. While the people persisted in their mistakes, Baruch immersed himself in the promises. There was no more stability, no solid ground, no temple, no altar. But there was the voice of God, and that voice still echoed. It was like an invisible thread that sustained him. There was a greater meaning, even if the days were dark. In his intimacy with Jeremiah, perhaps they wept together, reminisced about their days in Jerusalem, questioned the course of history, but they also grew stronger. The loyalty between the two was an alliance of souls called to serve without applause. And there, amid cultural and spiritual ruins, Baruch wrote what would become part of the scriptures that would span the centuries. It was this awareness that kept him steadfast, that his words were not just records, they were seeds. Seeds of truth that would one day sprout in thirsty hearts. Even though he did not see the fruit, Baruch was faithful in planting. Exile did not prevent him from believing. He discovered that true hope is not based on circumstances, but on promises. And so he continued to write, not for the eyes of that generation, but for the hearts of generations yet to come. Over the years, Baruch became more than a scribe. He became the guardian of a sacred memory. By recording Jeremiah's words, he preserved not only warnings, but also the prophet's tears. He wrote about judgment, yes, but also about divine compassion. Every sentence that flowed from Jeremiah's heart was laden with pain, and every stroke of Baruch's pen carried an echo of that silent pain. He had witnessed the ruin of his nation. He had seen the temple destroyed, the leaders corrupted, the people scattered. But paradoxically, it was in this setting of loss that Baruch discovered the beauty of divine hope. While many had lost faith, he continued to write about the God who promised to restore what had been broken. Baruch had the privilege of recording prophecies that looked beyond the destruction, words that spoke of a righteous renewal, of a time when God would raise up a descendant of David, of a people who would know the Lord intimately. He wrote about a new covenant, not engraved in stone, but in hearts. It was as if God, through Jeremiah, was drawing a bridge between the present pain and the future of redemption. And Baruch, with steady hands and a reverent spirit, gave visible form to these words. In every stroke there was reverence, in every line there was an unspoken prayer. Even without public recognition, he understood that his work had eternal value. The words he copied would be read by generations he could not even imagine. His mission was discreet but essential. He knew that what is written faithfully can cross the centuries and touch lives long after the silence of the writer. Between one scroll and another, between exiles and hopes, Baruch understood the profound mystery of serving a God who writes history with human instruments. Jeremiah spoke, wept, and announced. Baruch wrote, listened, and sustained. One proclaimed, the other preserved, and together, even though forgotten by many, they became instruments of the God who never forgets. In that silent mission, Baruch not only recorded the lamentations, he recorded God's persistent love. And that made him more than a scribe. It made him a living part of the eternal message. After so many words written, after so many moments alongside Jeremiah, the time for silence came. The records ceased. The pages of the Bible do not tell us how Baruch's life ended. No account describes his death. No text tells us where he was buried. It is as if he had disappeared among the scrolls he helped to preserve. But the silence of the scriptures does not mean oblivion. On the contrary, Baruch's legacy continued to echo through every scroll that passed through his hands. Through him, Jeremiah's message crossed time, withstood the fire of King Jehoiakim, survived exile, and reached us. What many tried to erase, Baruch helped to eternalize. The absence of public recognition in his day was, in fact, a powerful testimony to his humility. He did not seek titles, he did not found lineages, he did not perform miracles, but he was faithful. And it is this silent faithfulness that makes his story so profound. He served behind the scenes, but the God who sees in secret rewarded his dedication with an eternal place in the scriptures. It is possible that in the last years of his life, Baruch continued to write, perhaps copying other words from the prophets, perhaps teaching the next generation, or perhaps he lived in solitude, keeping only the flame of memory alive, trusting that even without visible fruit, he had fulfilled the purpose for which he had been called. His name is mentioned only a few times in the Bible, and yet what he wrote helped shape one of the most profound and painful books of Scripture. If Jeremiah is remembered as the prophet of tears, Baruch can be remembered as the scribe of seeds, the one who planted hope even when all seemed lost. Time has erased many powerful names from that generation. Kings, generals, priests, all have disappeared, but Baruch's name has remained. Discreet, yes, silent too, but engraved on scrolls that have survived time and come down to us as living witnesses of a God who speaks and of servants who listen to him with reverence. In the absence of applause, Baruch received something even greater, the certainty that his life, though forgotten by men, was known and used by God. As sacred history unfolded, many names gained prominence: kings, prophets, judges, leaders. But among the great deeds recorded, God also reserved a special place for those who served far from the spotlight. Baruch was one of those, invisible to the eyes of the people, but clearly seen by the eyes of God. He did not perform miracles. He did not liberate cities. He did not pronounce oracles. But he was where God placed him. He was faithful to the call he received, even when that call seemed small in the face of the pain he witnessed. And that made all the difference. While so many sought glory, Baruch sought to remain. His trajectory teaches us that there is dignity in serving in silence, that there is honor in sustaining the mission of another without competing for prominence. Baruch did not compete with Jeremiah. On the contrary, he embraced his role with humility and zeal. His faithfulness supported the prophet, his hands gave shape to the word, and his life bore witness to a faith that does not depend on the stage, but on purpose. The God who sees hearts saw every tear Baruch shed, every night he fought against discouragement, every scroll rewritten with effort and reverence. God saw what no one else saw. And that is what sustains the anonymous faithful, the certainty that the Lord of heaven values even the most discreet gestures when done with integrity. Baruch lived as a servant. His name appeared only a few times, but his influence spanned generations. He was a voice when Jeremiah could not speak. He was a memory when everything seemed forgotten. He was a bridge between pain and hope. And even though his last days are shrouded in mystery, his legacy remains. Baruch's story reminds us that before God, there are no invisible servants. There are only willing hearts. He was one of those hearts, available, obedient, persevering. His example is not in great achievements, but in constant faithfulness. Even when nothing made sense, even when no one applauded, even when the only certainty was that God was there, watching over everything. In the silence that ends his story, an eternal truth echoes: God sees, and what is done for him is never lost. Baruch's story ends without a definite ending. There are no reports of his death, nor monuments erected in his memory. But perhaps that is precisely what makes his life so deeply inspiring, because Baruch represents all those who serve without applause, who remain faithful even when human eyes do not see them, but who are completely known by God. He teaches us that serving the Lord is not about visible greatness, but about obedience in secret. That writing anonymously, carrying the word into exile, supporting the ministries of others, mourning the pains of a people, and remaining loyal even in frustration, all of this has eternal value when done sincerely before God. Baruch reminds us that not every faithful servant will be celebrated in this world. Sometimes God's call takes us to places of rejection, to serve unpopular causes, alongside prophetic voices that will not be heard. And yet, it is in this place that God forms his own. In his journey, Baruch faced the contempt of leaders, the silence of a rebellious people, the disappointment of seeing everything fall apart, and yet he continued to write. He continued to believe. He continued to obey. Today, his story echoes for all who have ever felt invisible in their service, for those who work behind the scenes, who intercede without recognition, who sustain ministries, who obey in silence. Baruch is a mirror of comfort for those who serve without the spotlight, but with their whole heart before God. His scrolls not only recorded the word, they taught us that quiet faithfulness builds lasting legacies. He challenges us to stop seeking greatness and find joy in simply being at the center of God's will, even if it takes us down difficult paths. Baruch's life teaches us that the true value of service is not in what men can see, but in silent faithfulness before God. Often our obedience takes place far from human eyes, in hidden places, without recognition or applause. Yet it is in this secret place that the Lord finds faithful hearts. Just as Baruk was indispensable support for Jeremiah, we are called to sustain others who also carry difficult missions. There is greatness in being a pillar for someone, in serving without vying for space, in supporting the calling of another, knowing that everything we do is part of the same divine purpose. We must also trust that even when the world does not recognize our dedication, God does not forget every gesture, every prayer, every word written in silence. The Lord values what we do for Him, not what men applaud. This awareness strengthens our hearts in days of discouragement and gives us the courage to continue. Baruch also reminds us of the importance of persevering when everything around us seems to be falling apart. Even in the face of rejection, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the people's persistence in disobedience, he remained steadfast. In the same way, our faith is called to resist, even when we do not see immediate results. Finally, his story shows us that obedience lived in secret builds eternal legacies. Often, we will not see the fruit of our seeds, but what we do in faithfulness to God remains beyond our own lives. To serve the Lord is to trust that He uses even the smallest gestures to write stories that will never be erased. If you enjoyed the story of Baruch and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.